Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back. We made it to the home stretch. This is our final and fourth fiscal session that we have scheduled for you this week. This session is on coordinated early intervening services, the fiscal requirements. CEIS fiscal requirements training for local education agencies is designed for new or experienced school program and business administrators to build capacity at the LEA level. This session will include a discussion of the key differences between voluntary CEIS and mandatory comprehensive CEIS requirements for each, the calculation methodology, and will allow IDEA grant recipients to make informed decisions regarding allowable use of funds, as well as better understand and meet reporting obligations by increasing your understanding of the requirements established by current regulations. This training is around CEIS fiscal requirements. So information around the data that gave you the significant disproportionality designation, that will come later as well. So this afternoon session is only on the fiscal requirements for those that are voluntary or those that are required for CEIS. Next slide. Again, I know you're tired of hearing me say this for the past 3 days, but this slide is our state strategic goals. At the State Department, we have 6 strategic goals that we plan and work around in all of our efforts. Each of these goals not only guide our work, but they serve as a framework for the intentional support and resources that we provide to the educators at the local level. Next slide. Every presentation we make includes the State Department of Education's vision and mission. We believe it is important to keep front and center our vision for creating a world-class educational system that equips every student with the knowledge and skills to be successful in college and in the workforce. And our mission at the State Department of Education is to provide leadership through the development of policy and accountability systems so that all of our students are prepared to compete in a global community. Next slide. The presenters today, we are so glad and excited to have back with us with the team from West Ed. We have Sarah Dutray, a Senior Program Associate 2 at West Ed, Anthony McConnell, a Senior Program Associate at West Ed, and Mari Shikazawa, a Program Associate at West Ed. As I've mentioned in the earlier sessions this week, West Ed has been assisting the Office of Special Education at the State Department of Ed and updating several of our fiscal monitoring processes and procedures, as well as our protocols. And over the next few years, they will continue to assist us throughout this process and then implementation of these new processes and procedures. Anthony, Mari, and Sarah are joining us today as content experts, and they are also gathering any feedback that we have as a group. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Brianna. She's going to give a quick update and some housekeeping that we need to do. And then after she finishes, it'll go straight on into, I think, Anthony, or is it Sarah? And then at the end of the day, Brianna will come back and give us some final updates regarding all 3 days. Okay, go ahead, Brianna.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. I'm Brianna Stewart. I'm the one that's been sending the millions of emails, and I apologize. I just kind of wanted to touch base of how everything would go as far as the credits and things such as that. From what Bobby just said, he kind of wants to save the process of how everything will be done towards the end. But I just wanted to kind of let you know on the head that at the end of today's session, if you attended all 3 days of training, you will be applicable for CEU and semi-credit. If you did not attend all 3 days, you will only be applicable for contact hours. We will talk more about this by the end of the day, so just save your questions, but excuse me, I'm sorry. Write down your questions and have them ready for when the session adjourns at 3:30. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Brianna. Anthony, or you or Sarah, which one of y'all are going to go over the, Okay, there we go. I think that's you, Anthony. Go ahead.
No, that's Sarah. Let Sarah
Oh.
take it this time.
Oh, okay. We're going to see if Sarah can do it differently. Okay, go ahead, Sarah.
They'll trust her more
So
than
we're
me.
going to check understanding. Thank you, Brianna. And it's great to hear on CEUs. We also wanted you to know that for those of you, especially those of you who may be CPAs, that WestEd is a certified provider of CPEs through the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy. And in this session and the previous sessions yesterday afternoon, the private school proportionate share, we can give 2 CPE hours for that. And for today's 2 sessions, 4 CPE hours. So if you're interested in that, you need to respond to all of the polls during our session today. That's what we use to show that you participated, and then provide your name and email address in the evaluation survey. So follow up with us if you have any questions about that, but we're happy to be able to provide those if that's helpful to any of you.
And I just wanted to add,
Anthony?
Sarah,
Okay, go
I just
ahead.
wanted to add
Yeah.
that, those CPE credit hours are also applicable for anybody who might have a certified governmental financial manager license, and also or the attorney. If you have a lawyer's license, you could also apply this to your CPE requirements. So just not only
your
the CPAs.
CLEs. That's right.
And thank you for that too, Anthony, for mentioning that, because our mediators are on the call as well through Dr. Tayl's shop and parent engagement. And I know a couple of them are attorneys. So I think this is great to be able to offer this for them as well.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to get us started this afternoon. And this is a topic that I know is of interest to many of you because there are a large handful or many districts this year that are going to be using funds for coordinated early intervening services. And so, as Bobby said, and we may remind you of this a few times, we're going to focus on the fiscal requirements related to both voluntary and mandatory comprehensive coordinated early intervening services, or CEIS. Our objectives are to increase your capacity to talk about that, increase your knowledge of the state specific requirements around that, identify allowable and non-allowable expenditures for CEIS or comprehensive CEIS, CCEIS funds, and locate the resources available. So to do that, we'll go through an agenda very similar to our other sessions. We'll start with an overview that I'll provide. We'll provide you a quick comparison of voluntary CEIS and mandatory comprehensive CEIS. We will talk about the state requirements. We'll talk about the interactions of CEIS and LEA MOE. There's an interaction there that you'll want to be aware of. And then we'll talk you through the calculation of CEIS amounts, allowable use of funds, and then hopefully we'll have time to end with a demonstration of a tool developed through 2 of our national centers that we help host at WestEd, the national or the Center for IDEA Fiscal Reporting, and we work on the IDEA Data Center as well. So work you through a tool with that. So we're going to start, as we have with our other sessions, with a poll. Oh, great. So there's the agenda I walked through. Mari, if you want to go to the next slide, we'll start with the poll. And this is going to be that reflection on your knowledge right now as we start at 1:40 p.m. What is your knowledge of both voluntary and mandatory comprehensive CEIS fiscal requirements under IDEA?
And I apologize. Anthony, can you check out the poll on yours? It looks like something happened on my end.
Oh, I can do it.
I can launch it.
Okay, thank you. It's coming up blank for me. I'm not sure. Again, my apologies. Zoom webinar is not wanting to function for me right now.
Are you guys seeing it now?
Yes, it's on our screen now.
Okay. And again, just remember, if you want to be eligible to receive CPE credit hours, make sure you answer all the polls.
Oh, we have somebody who can't see the poll.
It has disappeared.
Anthony, do you want to try to relaunch it?
Oh, you're gonna have to vote again. Sorry, when we relaunch. So if you already voted, please vote again. We'll see if we can figure that out before our next poll.
Are you seeing it now?
Yes. Julie or Della, do you see it now?
Oh, interesting. Do you have a polling button? Look on the panel, on the little row of buttons where you have to mute yourself. See if you can find polling there.
And if
think
you
it
aren't
does
seeing the
pop up in the
polls,
new
feel
window.
free to put your response in the chat. And if you are interested in receiving those CPE hours, then we can, we'll cross-reference it with the chat for you.
Thank you, Maury. Valerie, just put your letter in the chat as your answer, and Maury will cross-reference it with that. Same for you, Ann. If you do not see the actual poll pop up, just use the slide and put your response in the chat.
And for some, it might be like an issue with your computer. Maybe like logging out and back into Zoom might solve the problem. Could be an option too. If the majority of the attendees are seeing the polls.
Okay. Yeah, it looks like the majority are. We have 76% voted. So for now, let's just go with sharing those in the chat if you don't have it. So I'll share where we're at. This is where we're starting at our baseline this afternoon. The majority of participants are landing in fair with a fairly large group in a weak, and then a decent amount, almost 20% in strong or very strong. So a lot of places, a lot of room to grow again. And we hope that like this morning and yesterday afternoon, we'll be able to increase your confidence in CEIS fiscal knowledge as we move through the presentation today. So starting with a quick overview, and again, I am going to talk about what CEIS are and why they are important, why they're included in the IDEA law. And this context will help you understand the why for the work, which really will help you, I think, understand the fiscal requirements and why they are important. And so, like we said, additional training is coming on the data used to look at significant disproportionality, but we quickly want to talk about kind of some context for CEIS. So first of all, what are CEIS, or Coordinated Early Intervening Services? Coordinated Early Intervening Services, or CEIS, are, and Mari, if you'll go to the next slide, are services to help children who need additional academic and behavioral support to be successful in school. And so that is students, and you'll see in a minute, we'll talk about students with and without disabilities, but coordinated early intervening services really are just non-special education services that are additional supports for students who need them to be successful in school. They can include professional development, they can include educational and behavioral evaluation, services and supports. And like we'll discuss, they may be voluntary or mandatory. And if we go to the next slide, why these are important. The reason these are important is that they help us identify and address learning and behavior difficulties early, and delay us and help us not delay needed support. And Congress, when they created the provision of CEIS, was really connected to significant disproportionality and helping us avoid inappropriate over-identification of subgroups of children as having disabilities if some additional supports, or what the law calls early intervening services, would help them so they could be successful in the general education system without having to be identified as a student with a disability. And so that the intention is that these services, they're called early intervening because if we provide them before, and delay needing special education, they could help us with cost savings down the road and help us from potentially misidentifying students as having disabilities in order to get services from them. So the next big question is, who can benefit from these services? And this is really important because this was a change in the 2017 update to the regulations around disproportionality in CEIS, that voluntary CEIS, and this has been consistent since the 2004 reauthorization of IDEA, may only be used for students without disabilities. Students with disabilities may not receive CEIS if you're using those for voluntary CEIS. They may incidentally benefit from them if they're happening in the same class or with a group of students that they may not be recipients. For mandatory comprehensive CEIS that are required based on disproportionality, those services may be provided to children with or without disabilities age 3 through grade 12. And they should be particularly, but not exclusively, focused on the children in the groups where the district has been identified as having significant over-identification or significant disproportionality. So
Sarah?
that's a really big difference. Oh, go ahead, Anthony.
I think there's Tony Bell who raised his hand. I don't know if this is a mistake or they want to ask a question.
Oh, great. Tony, do you have a question?
Oh, thank you. The hand is no longer raised.
Okay.
Maybe it's a mistake.
Okay, so a mistake, but please do feel free to use the raise your hand feature or type a question into the chat or Q&A if you want that to come to us directly. We're happy to respond to questions as we go. And if there's something we miss, please have us circle back. So again, clear distinction here, voluntary CEIS should only be provided to students who do not have disabilities, but are in need of additional supports. Mandatory CEIS, a couple of different pieces there. They may also be provided to students with disabilities, but they should be focused on, not exclusive to, but focused on that group of students who's been significantly over-identified. So with that, we're going to do a quick check your understanding, get you going after lunch with hopefully an easier question here. How many types of coordinated early intervening services are defined under IDEA?
And maybe put in the chat, if you said 3, what are those? Bobby, you said, I know, it's not enough.
I'm going to give the LEAs a chance to respond.
All right, okay, that's fair.
Thanks. So it looks like we have several people in the chat with voluntary and mandatory. Mari, it looks like the responses have slowed down. I think I can end and share the poll. So we have, again, if we're grading here, a nice solid A here, that the correct answer is two types, voluntary and mandatory. I like that, Kristen, I like how you got to 3, and that's correct. Those are the 3 different areas for which you can be identified for significant disproportionality and thus have to provide or have required or mandatory CEIS. Those are placement, discipline, and category, or placement, discipline, and identification. So I think that was a solid reason to put 3, but this really was referring to that voluntary and mandatory or comprehensive is usually how you'll hear those responded or referred to. So thank you for responding to that, and we will continue forward. So I'm going to do a quick, again, help you understand the differences between voluntary and mandatory CEIS. We talked about in the difference in who can receive them, but let's just go through this really quickly. I think most of you probably, if you're budgeting for CEIS this next year, will be doing it for mandatory, and we have fewer who use it for voluntary, but important to understand nonetheless. And I will say I'm going to add this. This isn't in my notes, so hopefully I'm not in trouble with Anthony and Mari, but one thing that the U.S. Department of Education has made clear is that ESSER funds may be used for CEIS. So if you're thinking about doing voluntary CEIS this next year, you might want to consider using ESSER funds for those activities, and if that's allowable and simpler, but these are activities to consider that would be allowable with those funds as well. So let's look at the differences.
Hold on one second, Sarah.
Go ahead.
Will you clarify? Okay, one thing for clarification on that. So if they're required, they still have to use that 15% of their IDEA allocation. This is only if they were voluntary, they can use some of those district ESSER funds that they received.
Yep, absolutely. And if you were mandatory, you have to use funds from your 15%. You must use those. You could supplement those CEIS with other similar activities with the district ESSER funds as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, very good point there. You can't use ESSER funds in place. We can't supplant our mandatory CEIS funds. Okay, Mari, so if we pull up the next slide, this will give us some information. This is a good summary for you all, especially as I know you all have these slides and you take them moving forward to remind yourselves of this. But there are distinct regulations, and these are in different parts of the regulations, voluntary CEIS and mandatory CEIS. And it's very important to know whether you are doing mandatory or voluntary CEIS when you start to budget and look at how you're going to use the funds. And again, like I said, the voluntary CEIS, the CEIS in general first appeared in the 2004 reauthorization, and that reauthorization intended to allow for a more flexible use of part of the funds to serve students earlier. And so voluntary CEIS really is about this allowance for more flexible funding to serve students before they get into special education. It allows the LEA to use up to 15% of funds. It's triggered by student need for academic and behavioral support. The district saying, hey, we have some students who need some additional supports. We have some students who we've identified for some reason as not quite being eligible for special ed that really could use some additional funds. You may reserve up to 15% of your section 611 and 619 funds. You may use them only for grades K through 12, and they must be students who do not have IEPs, who've not yet been identified for special education. Those funds, another point I'll point out here is we often talk about early intervention is another term we use a lot, or EIS also. Early intervention services, we refer to students who are birth to age 3. Early intervening are these services before special education, but within that school age, and especially for voluntary, only for kindergarten through grades 12. For mandatory comprehensive CEIS, these regulations, like I said, in 2017, we were first required to implement them. I think December 2016, the department finalized new regulations related to significant disproportionality. Previously, mandatory CEIS, these requirements looked much more like those for voluntary, but when they changed the regulations for significant disproportionality, they also updated this. So mandatory CEIS are in a different section of the law, section 306-46. They're triggered by the significant disproportionality determination. It's not a may reserve, it's must reserve. And on voluntary, it was up to 15%. Mandatory, it is exactly 15% of your total section 611 and 619 funds. Because we do look at significant disproportionality for children down to age 3, those funds may be used for services, early intervening services down to age 3 through grade 12. And they may be used for students who do have IEPs or who have already been identified as having a disability. This means that if, for example, I've been identified for comprehensive CEIS and discipline, that I can do that behavior intervention or whatever intervention or assessment I want to do for my students with and without disabilities in the school. And then again, particularly, but not exclusively focused on the group that was over-identified. Next slide, Mari. Okay, in addition to the key differences from that previous slide, it's also important to understand some differences in how the funds may be used. And this is important because, again, when we get to the next slide on mandatory mandatory comprehensive CEIS, it's going to be a little different from this, but voluntary CEIS, it can be used for professional development, and then those educational and behavioral evaluation services and supports, including scientifically based literacy instruction. Those are in the law. It's important to look at professional development, that the PD is not just any professional development. So I can't provide professional development on how to use my IEP system, but the law does say that professional development should be used to enable school staff to deliver scientifically based academic and behavioral interventions. So it still needs to, again, be contributing to addressing this need you've identified, that the need's been identified by identifying a group of kids who need something extra in the district or the school, and that professional development is targeted toward those behavioral or scientifically based academic instructions that are needed. For mandatory CEIS, this looks very similar. So the reserved funds, which are exactly 15% of your district allocation, the 611 and 619 total allocations, must be used to provide professional development and these educational and behavioral evaluation services and supports. These activities must, and this is important again, when we're involuntary, there's a lot more flexibility. When we move over to mandatory, we see must a lot more. And in addition, these activities must address the factors contributing to the significant disproportionality, or address a policy, practice, or procedure identified by the LEA as contributing to significant disproportionality. So as you have been identified for significant disproportionality, you're examining that, there should be a clear connection between your examination of the factors contributing to significant disproportionality and the allowable uses of those funds. Those activities, whether it's professional development or evaluations, they have to address the factors contributing to significant disproportionality. And those factors could be things such as a lack of access to scientifically based instruction, economic, cultural, or linguistic barriers or bias in the identification and eligibility determination processes or in your discipline processes, inappropriate use of disciplinary removals for students with disabilities, especially in, again, a cultural or linguistic bias there that exists in that use of disciplinary removals, a lack of access to diagnostic screenings, differences in academic achievement levels that are leading to a certain group being over-identified, over-placed in more restrictive settings, or over-disciplined compared to their peers. So as you think about this, you really have to get down to that. There's a question in the chat, and April asked, may we use psychometrist professional development for mandatory CCEIS? And April, this is my favorite answer, as you all know from yesterday if you were on, but it depends. If you can show that that was a contributing factor to your disproportionality, then yes. And so if you need to do professional development on how to assess the needs of students and those psychometric considerations when we're determining eligibility, absolutely. If you can show that that is a contributing factor to significant disproportionality, yes. And I say it depends because it makes sense. I can make that connection if you've been identified for significant disproportionality in identification of students with disabilities, and especially in specific disability categories. A lot of times we see that type of professional development when the over-identification is in identifying students with specific learning disabilities and thinking through that. It may not be a contributing factor if we're over-identified for discipline or for placement. So that's, again, where you would want to think about, the area where you've been identified, the group of students who's been identified, and then make that connection back. But yes, that's absolutely, when you've been identified for identification, that would be a justifiable professional development. Okay, any other questions on this? Can we pay for the evaluation? That's a good question. Is it Zatara? Can you provide a little bit more information? It may be used for educational and behavioral evaluations. That is an allowable use of CEIS funds, but it should not be used to be doing initial or reevaluations that are required activities under IDEA. So if you're evaluating students who have additional supports that aren't yet students with disabilities, or evaluating what students with and without disabilities need under what types of interventions they need, or conducting evaluations to help inform instruction, that would be appropriate. But the initial, if we're talking about initial evaluations to determine eligibility, that would not be CCEIS. Okay, perfect. Thanks for that clarification. And we'll keep talking about allowable uses in a minute. So we'll keep going. And if you have additional questions about that, I think you'll have another chance to talk about that. Reporting requirements. This is a piece in NCAPS, and I will say that almost always when we talk to districts about this, and when we have more in-depth conversations with districts, they say, gosh, that's not very much, this isn't very much data. So I want to say that this is what you are required to report to the state, and what the state is required to report to the federal government. There are probably a lot of other data, and we're going to demonstrate a tool at the end of the session today that give you some ideas that are more helpful data to help you know what is working for CEIS. For voluntary CEIS, the LEA is required to report to the state the number of children who received early intervening services, CEIS. So how many students received CEIS, and the number of those students who in the following 2 years were identified for special education. So what we're looking at is, if I'm providing services, if I just provided voluntary CEIS in the 1920 school year, we want to know how many children received CEIS. And of those students, so let's say I provided 100 children with voluntary CEIS. I did training for 3 first grade teachers on scientifically based interventions, and they identified 100 students across, let's say 5 first grade teachers, and they identified 100 students as needing additional supports. Then we need to follow those students and make sure those students are tracked for 2 years to see if they are later identified as eligible for special education and related services. For mandatory CEIS, the new regulations, that there was kind of a pause and a to be determined. We haven't gotten yet on tracking students, but the LEA is required to publicly report on any revisions needed to your policies, practices, and procedures. And there may be additional reporting requirements at a future date. So it really is for that. That's more on that programmatic side, the review of your policies, procedures, and practices. Okay. And there is a resource that is created by the IDEA Data Center, and it helps us look at the differences in all of these pieces. And so we recommend it. We don't have a screenshot in the slides, do we? No. So you'll just want to go to that link, but this is a link that really helps you to keep the distinctions between voluntary and required really clear. And I'll put a link to it in the chat really quick so you can pull that up if you can't pull it up from the slides that you have.
Sarah, I'm going to put it in the chat right now.
Okay, I think I got it. But it's just a good review. But as you're thinking about planning, and especially if you've done voluntary CEIS before, and this next year you're having to plan for mandatory comprehensive CEIS, you really want to make sure you understand these differences and the nuances, because you could easily get flipped around and accidentally use mandatory CEIS more in the way that's intended for voluntary, and that could be problematic down the road. So important pieces to understand, and a good resource to just keep this information at your fingertips. And with that, I think I'm going to end with a couple polls, right? And then my section's over. Anthony, does that sound right? Okay. So our first question is, An LEA implementing voluntary CEIS plans to use the reserved funds to provide professional development to its preschool teachers. Is this an appropriate use of funds reserved for voluntary CEIS? So remember, this was one of our key differences, is this age group who can be served. And I'll tell you, for any policy wonks, my way of always remembering this is that voluntary goes back to the 2004 reauthorization, and we've learned a lot since then about who probably needs to receive CEIS.
And we see some comment in the chats, interesting ones.
Oh, great. Yep. Voluntary is for K-12. A lot of people chatting that. If you heard that and want to change your answer, you can real quick, but let's go ahead. It looks like things have slowed down. Let's end the poll. And the comments in the chat and the large majority here, again, 61% are correct, that for voluntary CEIS, voluntary CEIS funds may not be used for preschool students. And so professional development is an allowable activity. That's a yes. But preschool teachers, I guess we're making an assumption here, if I'm like playing my own what if or maybe game, that if those preschool teachers were being used to provide interventions to students in kindergarten, then we could provide them with professional development. But if we make the assumption that they're going to work with preschoolers, then that would not be an appropriate use of voluntary CEIS. They are for grades K through 12 only. Again, if you were using those preschool teachers somehow to provide interventions for younger grades that are kindergarten and higher, that might be okay, but this would not be an allowable activity unless that were specifically laid out.
This one was a tricky one. The word preschool.
Yeah.
Good job for catching
Intentionally.
those.
And I want to point out one thing, and this comes up again later, but this is it. I want to, if you're experiencing some cognitive dissonance or having to do some mental gymnastics, it is weird because you may use your 619 funds, and when we calculate the total amount for voluntary CEIS, we do include those 619 funds or preschool funds, but they're not you can't use it for preschool kids. So I just want to point that out, that if you're thinking that seems backward, it is a little bit. Okay, moving on to the next poll. The next question is, and this is a true, false, or you can answer unsure, but the statement is an LEA may use funds for mandatory CCEIS for behavior interventions for children with and without disabilities. So there's one piece there. In middle school, so there's an age, right? So we have their disability status or age, and particularly, but not exclusively, children and groups who are significantly over-identified. And I like in the chat, we got one, depends on the category identified in. Yeah, that disclaimer at the end kind of leaves a lot of space for that, right? That it depends on how they were identified. I think Kimberly Lancaster also, the other piece that's interesting there is behavior interventions may not be appropriate if you were identified for an academic area or a or for placement, and it could come back to that. Okay, Anthony, should we go ahead and end the poll?
Yeah, I think there was a question in the chat from Jen. Did you already get to that?
Perfect.
Can I use mandatory?
I did not.
Fund?
Can I use mandatory funds for PD for MTSS on our campuses? This is for over-identification for SLD. Great question, Jan. Let's talk about the poll really quick. And then Anthony, do you bring up MTSS later, or should I go ahead and talk about that right now?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, So let's close out the poll here first. Most people said true. And it is true. I think that's the answer. We kind of left that really big caveat at the end that this is particularly, but not exclusively, those children and groups who are significantly over-identified. And then Kimberly's point was really great, that we would need to show the connection back that discipline is addressing a root cause. So it may be, again, that placement, we're over-placing students from a specific group in more restrictive placements. And when we do our root cause, we find out that it's because they have discipline problems, and that's why they're being removed more often from the regular classroom and not participating. And so that behavior intervention would be really appropriate. It's possible to, and I would say this goes both ways, and why that root cause analysis is so important when you're identified, that sometimes we find that behavior is actually contributing to lack of academic progress as well, and that lack of academic progress is contributing to behavior, which leads to disproportionality in discipline. So those definitely are not exclusive, but you'll want to make that connection. And then Jan, I want to quickly talk about Jan's question. And the answer is it depends. That's no surprise to anyone. But you may use that PD for MTSS on your campuses if, again, you can connect it back. So do you know, what are the contributing factors for over-identification for specific learning disabilities? Are you over-identifying students because your teachers don't have any other way to provide intervention, and the only options are core instruction or an IEP, and there are no tiers between that, and you are trying to help teachers understand how to understand when a student needs intervention and what a multi-tiered system of support looks like? Absolutely, you can make that connection. But again, you'll want to make sure you are able to justify how that addresses the contributing factors, and make sure that you can make that connection. The other piece I will say with that is that for mandatory right now, we're not required to count students and track those students, but you still want to identify a group of students that you're intending to impact with your CEIS funds. And so if I were doing that, Jan, I would probably say, like, let's drill down and see, gosh, it's really students who are struggling with reading that we're over-identifying when we had over-identification for SLD. And it's students, like, how would we know? And so we might say, oh gosh, in kindergarten through third grade, or even all our elementary campuses, we've recognized there's this group of students, and we have criteria for tier 2, that those are our kids. We would want to keep track of those kids. Who were those kids that need additional supports but aren't yet students with disabilities? And Kimberly, that is correct, that right now there's no reporting requirement to the feds. OSEP may require reporting at a later time, but you're not required to. I highly recommend continuing to track. And like I said, I think I always highly recommend to districts that you want to collect even more data than what is required, because we want to know, were these effective? Because if you find out it's effective, you may want to invest some more funds in it. And I would say, especially right now with how many extra funds you have from the recovery funds, as you think about that, it's really good to track. So while the state is not required to report to OSEP right now, the state can require you to report to them still to track that. And we highly recommend that you continue tracking. But yeah, so you'll want to identify that group. Oh, good question, April. Are there any suggestions for use of funds for over-identification of intellectual disability? And April, I think with that, again, as you start to look at the contributing factors for that, it may be that if you look at that, do you have students who were initially identified perhaps in younger grades as having a specific learning disability, and then as they progress in age are shifting to intellectual disability, or students being immediately identified? And usually their reading or language is low, Kimberly, you're right. And so how do we increase our reading intervention? And this is a case, I think, that over-identification of intellectual disability provides you with a really nice space. And I'm probably crossing a little too far into the program piece of this from fiscal. So I'll stop after this and we can talk about that. more later, but this is a place where if you have kids who are, if you look at those students who are over-identified for intellectual disability, and in the younger grades, they're identified as having a specific learning disability, you may want to beef up your reading interventions for your elementary kids with specific learning disabilities. We're learning that, right, that it's progressing because we may not be intervening enough. So that's something to look at. And then the other piece I would say is going back to look at your identification procedures. Is there bias, or do you have tools that are culturally responsive that you're using to make that determination that they have an intellectual disability? So a little sidetrack there, but a good sidetrack, because we have to be thinking about those root causes when we start digging into allowable use of funds. So I am going to now pass it on to Mari, who's going to talk about some of the state-specific requirements in Mississippi.
Thank you, Sarah. So now that we understand what is required under IDEA, let's get into what MDE requires from districts. So hopefully this slide looks very familiar to you, because Mississippi actually uses the same definition for voluntary and mandatory or comprehensive CEIS. And again, voluntary CEIS may be provided to children without a disability in kindergarten, including 4-year-old kindergarten students through grade 12, with a particular emphasis on students in kindergarten through grade 3. And comprehensive CEIS may be provided to students with or without disabilities, ages 3 through grade 12, specifically, but not exclusively, children in those groups who were significantly over-identified. Also, comprehensive CEIS activities cannot be limited to only children with disabilities. And again, we can see that clear difference between the targeted group of students and the activities for each of these CEISs. Both of these types of CEIS, however, are really to help ensure, again, that those at-risk students are only referred to special education when it's necessary and appropriate, and to prevent the over-identification of specific student groups or subgroups of students, which would lead to a determination of significant disproportionality. So when districts choose that they want to set aside funds for CEIS, they do this through their MCAPS funding application. And in order to set aside those funds, LEAs are required to complete the following process that are shown on this table. So you need to fill out the narrative for voluntary use of funds in the CEIS section in the MCAPS funding application, including information about the target audience and activities or intervening services. And again, when reviewers are looking at this, the fiscal side is going to be looking at the allowable use of funds, but the programmatic side is really going to try to tie it together to understand whether or not the audience and activities, it makes sense, right? Is there a correlation? So the second step is that the LEA budgets the total amount of IDA Part B or preschool funds in the funding application. And this would be done through either the IDA Part B budget and in coordination with the IDA preschool budget. So again, those are two separate pieces that you need to budget for. And the MCAPS application automatically calculates what that 15% is going to look like. So you're not going to be able to exceed it. And again, remembering that if you are voluntarily setting aside funds for CEIS, the LEA has some flexibility, right? You can budget anywhere between 0 to 15%. And the LEA also maintains some flexibility as to where that money is being budgeted from. So you can budget 15% of Part B, 15% of preschool, or any combination that does not exceed that 15% of your total Part B and preschool allocation. Each line item budgeted in the IDA Part B or preschool budget has to also include a narrative description. So that is similar to all of the narrative description pieces that you have to include in that larger Part B or preschool budget. And then at that point, when you submit the entire application, the fiscal team is going to review for completeness. And then they're going to push it to the data team or the TA team or whoever helps you guys really determine what those plans are going to look like. And they're going to review this compared to your LEA determination report and make sure that if you are identified for significant disproportionality, you're not budgeting the funds in your voluntary when it should be the required or mandatory. But again, this step should be automatically done through MCAPs for these purposes. And then
Mari?
yeah, sorry.
We have a question in the chat, sorry.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
From Jane.
Jane.
So Jane, she said, we used voluntary CEIS fund last year, and we have been put on notice that we have over-identified students in SLD. What happens to the voluntary funds and tracking?
Yes. So the great one flexible thing about voluntary CEIS funds is they can always be reverted back to general IDEA funds. So for example, if you still have carryover funds from those voluntary funds, and this year you're going to be required to set aside mandatory CEIS funds, the remaining balance can actually be moved back into your general IDEA funds for other purposes. In terms of the data collection, you are going to be required to submit data and tracking for the year that you reserve those voluntary CEIS funds. So those tracking and data reporting requirements still apply.
And also something that I wanted to add, if, for example, you set aside voluntary CEIS last year, and you already had some activity budgeted that you were going to accomplish, and in the next year, you are now required to do CCEIS. I think you could still continue to use your voluntary CEIS for the plan that was initially budgeted for, because the mandatory CEIS is a new fiscal year, and you will select a new grant period for which you will set aside CCEIS funds, Jane. So I hope that also clarifies it.
Yes, thank you, Anthony. I'm sorry, I made the assumption that you wanted to not use those funds for voluntary CEIS since you'll be embarking on a new journey through required CEIS.
And then one also clarification is that in the fiscal year where you are determined to have significant disproportionality, you no longer have the flexibility to use CEIS, voluntary CEIS, because when you do mandatory CEIS, then you cannot do for voluntary CEIS. It's one or the other one.
Yes, the 15% is across both. Unfortunately, you couldn't do mandatory and voluntary. It may be that some of the activities that you've started through your voluntary CEIS application are relevant to what you've been identified for through significant disproportionality and mandatory CEIS. So, again, if those linkages are there and it makes sense, then that might be an activity that you can continue. So moving on through the rest of the actions that would take place that would lead to an approved funding application for voluntary CEIS. Oh, and yeah, thanks, Anthony. Jan, feel free to include additional clarifying questions in the chat, or if you raise your hand, then we can unmute you and dig a little deeper. So once the data team reviews the plan for appropriateness and compliance with the federal regulations, then the data team will approve the plan. And if the costs are allowable, then the fiscal team will also approve the plan. If the activities are found not to be allowable, then your district representative will reach out to you for revisions. And finally, once everything has been reviewed and approved, then you'll be able to move forward with those voluntary CEIS funds. And sorry, Jan, it looks like you had to step out for a little bit of that conversation. If you have specific questions, we can definitely answer those either after the session. A recording will also be made available. So I don't know if that's helpful. Maybe we can send you over the minute that we start diving into the situation a little bit more thoroughly. Okay. Great. Any questions about the application and review process? This should look kind of familiar, but again, there will be some updates made to the funding application this year to hopefully make this a little bit more seamless. Okay, great. So as we know, mandatory or comprehensive CEIS differs from voluntary. So under these regulations, the MDEOSC is required to provide for the collection and examination of data to determine if significant disproportionality based on race and ethnicity is occurring in the state and the LEAs of the state with respect to one, the identification of children with disabilities, including the identification of children as children with disabilities in accordance with a particular impairment described in this section. So we heard some examples in the chat already for the over-identification of students for SLD. The placement in a particular educational setting of these children. So when we're thinking about that LRE continuum, are we seeing a disproportionate representation in any of those educational settings? And then 3, incidence, duration, and type of disciplinary actions, including suspensions and expulsions. So the process for budgeting for CCIS funds differs from voluntary. And this first piece that's not included on here is really on the programmatic side. So before you're even able to go into MCAPS and start budgeting and submitting that plan for your CCIS funds, MDE OSC will provide a training with those LEAs that have been identified for significant disproportionality. And based on the outcomes of those trainings, that's what the LEA is going to use to create that CCIS plan narrative and budget. Again, like Sarah said, there will be additional support available to help you identify those root cause analysis and making sure that you're connecting those plans back to the root cause. Those CCIS plan narratives and budgets are reviewed by the fiscal and data teams. And then the role of the fiscal team, which is why we're here today, is really just to ensure that those activities are allowable under IDA and EDGAR, and to make sure that those funds are not used to supplant existing funding. And then the process for the actual application and review through MCAPS is very similar to voluntary CEIS, except for, again, those couple of programmatic pieces as precursors to the entire process. So the LEA fills out that narrative for mandatory use of funds in the CEIS section. You guys will see the new MCAPS application again. It's great. So there will be a separate page for CEIS that lays this all out for you and identify whether or not you've been triggered as voluntary or mandatory. And the plan section within CCIS is a little bit different because it will include some additional information that the LEA will have to enter, such as the areas of disproportionality that the LEA has been identified with. And then similarly, you're going to include the target students and the activities for the intervening services. Again, one of those main differences between voluntary and mandatory CEIS or comprehensive CCEIS is that the LEA has to budget that maximum 15% of their total IDA Part B and preschool funds. So again, that differs from voluntary, where the LEA can choose what percentage up to that 15% that they want to budget. And again, MCAPS will automatically auto check to ensure that the total amount, and for this is actually a typo, so my apologies, that the total amount is exactly 15%. So that edit check will be there and in place for LEAs to help ensure compliance. And again, the LEA has that flexibility to reserve those funds from their section 11, so their Part B grant, 619 preschool, or any combination of either of those awards. And again, each line item in their budget has to include a narrative description. So this is separate from the plan that you're submitting. This is a specific narrative about the amount that you are budgeting in your application. Once you've submitted your entire funding application, the fiscal team reviews your application for completeness. And then that's when we pass it to the data team. And this will be a more comprehensive review than what we're doing for voluntary. So they're going to review the LEA determination report for the CEIS eligibility. And then again, that plan to make sure that it's appropriate and it's in compliance. Based on those trainings and conversations that you'll be having with other teams, you'll definitely, you'll know beforehand, right, if you're on the right track, and they'll know a little bit more what to look for. Once the data, yeah.
We have a couple questions in the chat.
Okay, great, thank you.
So from Susan, any idea when the training for mandatory CCEIS will be? I think she's referring to program training.
Yes, and unfortunately, Bobby, I'm not sure if you know exactly when that's going to be. I think that the team is still planning and coordinating what those trainings are going to look like. Bobby, let me know if I'm off base, but I assume that they'll be reaching out with additional information.
Okay. And then the second question from April, could the salary of a MTSS coordinator be used in CCEIS to ensure that the MTSS process is done with fidelity? And, you know,
No, go ahead, Anthony.
yeah, so I think like Sarah mentioned earlier in the call, I think for CCEIS, you know, you have significant disproportionality, and that's why you are required to set aside your CEIS fund. And the reason why you have significant disproportionality is because you have over-identification in specific area. Then the question to ask is the MTSS activity, coordinator activities, is really addressing those factors that contributed to significant disproportionality? You have to be able to establish that type of connection to determine if those funds could be charged to your CCEIS. If it was something that you were doing in the past before you were identified for significant disproportionality, I'm more tempted to say that, you know, if you're already doing it, but you ended up having over-identification, maybe that wasn't working for you. You might want to consider something else.
Yeah, and I would say, Anthony, this is Sarah, I'll just weigh in on that too, that it's rare that it's the full salary that really is related to CCEIS, and it's usually a part of it. So thinking about like what part of their job is related to that. And again, like Anthony said, if you've always had that, then it's not an intervention to pay for it with different money, right? So it shouldn't be something that you're just paying for with different money. So you should think about that. And I would say almost always when I've helped a district work through a plan with that, it's been that a portion of that, when we think about, okay, what portion of MTSS is really around, like really focused on this group of kids that we're over-identifying.
And I see
Cindy,
that.
you raised your hand.
Yep, I'm going to bring her in. Cindy, you are now with us if you want to unmute.
Hey guys. So MTSS is a state law and is required for districts in the state. So where do we draw the line that we're getting into supplanting, because that is a requirement by the district? And so I want to, you know, as I hear more and more questions about MTSS and CEIS funds being used for that, I just want to make sure that we're being very clear that we're not supplanting. So could y'all address that issue, please?
Sure, you definitely need to show that you're doing something extra, right? It has to supplement. And so that's part of this, that if this like is a new position, a coordinator to ensure it's done with fidelity, and you've never had that, I'm assuming that the state law doesn't require funding of a position to ensure it's done with fidelity. The state requires that, but yeah, you always need to show how this is something new or supplemental in addition to what you already are doing. I think it's tricky, Cindy, and I'm not familiar enough with the requirements around MTSS, so maybe that's something we should familiarize ourselves with more, but to really know what would be supplemental and supplanting, because I'm not sure what is required, because if the law allows you to have some just like a commitment to MTSS in place, right? Or if that has positions or certain activities, but you'd want to be able to show this is something more than what you've done in the past.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Am I still unmuted?
Yes.
Okay. I know that is state. It's school. I think it's School Board Policy 4300. Just for y'all's information at West Ed to kind of look at that and see, because from my understanding and my experience with it, it's a pretty comprehensive program. Now, certainly it doesn't require an MTSS coordinator to look at fidelity, but it does have fidelity pieces incorporated into that, where somebody should be checking the fidelity of those interventions. And we've got there's a big manual that goes along with that. So I would just be very cautious if I were a district in trying to provide MTSS type services with CEIS funds. And that's kind of always been MDE's, OSE's take on that, is to be very cautious about that because it is a state requirement for districts.
And the position is funded by the states, right, Cindy? If I understand correctly.
There is no position, Anthony. And I'm going to look up that state board policy because I'm like Cindy. That was the old policy name, was 4300, and I'll look that up and put it in the chat for y'all. But there is a state board policy that every school district has to have a teacher support team and a district support team. So teacher support team at each school and a district support team. And there's processes, and like Cindy mentioned, fidelity checks on things that they have to do for tier 1 students, what has to happen for tier 2 students, and what has to happen for tier 3. So each district should already have somebody that's managing that, because some of those students are automatically populated in our local package, our local information package, based on meeting specific criteria. And so I think that's where Cindy, because I mean, again, and Cindy, I don't mean this in a negative way, but Cindy has been around a while in the state of Mississippi. And
I'm just going to laugh at that, Bobby.
and I mean that in a positive way.
Yeah,
so,
and we
Cindy's
appreciate
lots of
Cindy's
changes.
Cindy's experience. And if what I want to say that, and somebody put in the chat that what if MTSS is not done correctly? It's important to know that, like, if you're adding something to it or adding a component or adding an intervention. So I would say, like, for example, I worked with a district. I think it would still be allowed, even though you're required to have MTSS, if your existing MTSS system can only serve a certain group of students, right? So let's say we're using Lexia, and right now kids who miss 3 standards are like get to go up to level 2 and get an intervention, but there are kids who are missing 1 standard that could use interventions too. I'm not sure that that works with Lexia, but with like Dibbles and stuff, right? If you're below emerging. So if you're saying, like, we're going to expand level 2 to include more students, if we're going to like add something to our MTSS system, but I think you'd really have to be clear that you're adding something to it, not just paying for what already exists. So just because they should be doing it. If it's not being done right. But yeah, it's making that connection though back to the group that was over identified and drilling all the way down and then figuring out what more is needed.
Any follow-up?
I've always kind of thought that as long as it's in addition to, that you're really on some safe ground with that, because for a lot of those children, getting an additional intervention, for whatever that root cause might be, is a good thing, so in addition to, and I think that's just a good way to kind of think about this CCEIS process to me.
And Cindy, I agree, it's fair, because if you had significant disproportionality and you were doing things in your district and you still ended up having significant disproportionality, that means whatever you were doing was not helping. So
Correct.
Trying to address it should be most likely with something different.
Yes. Thank y'all for listening.
No, great addition.
Thank you so much, Cindy. Any other questions before we move on from this topic? And I promise this will not be the last time that it comes up. Okay, great. So I'm not quite sure exactly where I left off with the application and review process, but just know that there are 2 teams that are going to be reviewing to ensure compliance. That's both the fiscal team and the data team. And the fiscal team will be the final team that ends up approving the plan within the MCAPS funding application. And one thing to note that I don't think I mentioned before is that both the CCEIS and the voluntary CEIS plan and narrative are required to be submitted at the time when the LEA submits their funding application or by the due date that MDE sets to receive those funding applications. If anyone's been identified for significant disproportionality and doesn't include a CCEIS plan, narrative, or budget, then the application will not be approved. So Sarah touched on this lightly around the federal requirements for data tracking and reporting. It's different. It's important to note that in Mississippi, those requirements are a little bit different. So LEAs that are required or have CCEIS or voluntarily set aside CEIS funds are required to submit an annual CEIS report as part of its annual submission to MDE by June 30th. And the report must include the following. So again, what Sarah was saying, all three of these reporting requirements used to be required for both voluntary and for mandatory CEIS. And right now there's a little bit of a gap in what those requirements as directed through the regulations, but we do foresee this becoming, a general reporting requirement from Mississippi to the department. So again, the report has to include the number of students served in year one, the number of students served in year one who subsequently received special education services and in year one, and then the students served in year one who subsequently received special education services in year two. Additionally, students who receive services funded by CEIS have to be identified within MSIS, and this really allows MDE to also track the students in subsequent years for additional information and data analysis. And as we know, the voluntary CEIS data is submitted to the department as part of a required data submission. And as a reminder, the report also requires the signature of the special education director or other designee.
Hey, Mari, just real quick, when you talk about that slide you were just on, are you talking about that related document, or are you talking about the information they actually enter on that page in MSIS? I mean, in MCAPS.
This is a separate annual CEIS report that is submitted June 30th to Mississippi Department of Education. So what's submitted within the MCAPS application is just the amount of funds and those pieces that we mentioned that were part of the CEIS narrative and plan. So the target students, the types of interventions. For required CEIS, it would also include the reason that they were identified for, or the reason that they were identified for significant disproportionality.
Okay, I may need to get some clarification on that. I'm not familiar with the LEAs being required to submit something else in addition to us by June the 30th. So I may need to get some more clarification on that.
Okay, yeah, I think that's through Sharon's team. That's not through fiscal.
Okay.
This is just the data piece of like the additional reporting requirements by LEA. So this has nothing to do with the MCAPS application. And okay, we have a question from Patricia, excuse me. Speaking of MSIS, how do we get students removed from that screen? We do not use CEIS funds, but we have students tagged. Now that we are mandatory, I would like those removed. And Sharon, I know that you're on the call, so I can pull you up, or if this is something that we think maybe we should talk about offline. It sounds like you might require some technical assistance from the data team. And Sharon, I'm trying to find you. I just know that you're on here.
Okay, I think she's unmuted. Go ahead, Sharon. Okay, Patricia, she asked for you to repeat the question. Or
okay,
here, I'll just read it.
Sharon, you're on. You're brought to the room now. So okay. The question is in the chat, and she just asked, how do we get students removed from that screen within MSIS?
So hold on, sorry y'all. So I can go in and look, Kenny. I'm not sure. I think it might just be as simple as unchecking them in MSIS or taking the CEIS indicator off. But I'll look into that and find out for you, because I think there is a little there's a little bit of difference in the way that we've been tracking them voluntarily using that related document in MCAPS and then what's being put into MSIS. So when we do the training for the required CE, those districts that are required, I'll go over that with y'all, but I believe you should be able to just take the CEIS indicator off in MSIS or through your local package, and then it would roll into MSIS. But if you've used those monies voluntarily already, we've got to keep tracking those students. Is that correct, Mari?
Yes. And I think that for the data piece, we feel free to include those questions in the chat.
No, she's not. She's
Okay.
Sorry. Okay. I think for those data pieces, I think that maybe we should just put that on hold for right now and continue. And then we can have Sharon reach out specifically, because there seems to be a question from Kimberly around the CCEIS. Then we'll know what goes into MCAPS. And Patricia said she went back 5 years and 4 out of 5 had students tagged. I don't know how they are getting tagged. So I think that those are like maybe more specific incidences that hopefully can be resolved.
Yeah, I'll look into all of that for y'all and let you know for sure.
Thank you. Hopefully it's just some glitch in the system. Thank you so much, Sharon.
No problem.
Let's see if there's anything else. Okay. Yes. So there's some great feedback from your colleagues in the chat. We had to unselect the students in our SAM package when we were complete with our CEIS period. And I assume that that's for the entire reporting period for which data is required. So thank you, Mendy. It's really helpful. Okay. So again, that was just a really quick primer around the data reporting requirements by MDE. And then again, noticing that there is a slight difference between what is required federally and what is required by the state. This slide is just a couple of pieces to note specifically related to counting and tracking students who are served by personnel who participated in professional development activities supported with CEIS or participated in school-wide interventions, as well as behavioral and educational evaluation. So it might not be appropriate to count all of the students that are engaged in those activities. So specifically for professional development, the LEA should count the number of students in need of additional support who received instruction from personnel who participated in the professional development. Again, just because you provide professional development to certain staff and then they end up working with all students, it's not appropriate to count every single student within that data tracking. In terms of school-wide intervention initiatives, the LEA should only count students who meet the LEA's criteria of needing additional support and participate in the initiative as receiving CEIS in the years or the years immediately following the initiative. And again, they're to be tracked for 2 years. So again, only the students that have been identified as needing additional supports should be included in that count. And then lastly, for behavioral and educational evaluations, you really should only count the students who are evaluated to determine the supports necessary for success in the general education environment in the year of or the year immediately following the evaluation and tracked again for the following 2 years. So if you're using these evaluations for other purposes, such as a reevaluation or initial evaluation for students' eligibility, then those would not be appropriate to be tracked. Okay, I know that was a lot of information around the Mississippi specific requirements. And again, hopefully some of those looked quite familiar to what you saw from the federal regulations. But even though you are so fortunate to have CEIS calculated on behalf of your districts, we're going to talk a little bit about how that calculation is done. And again, LEAs will have a determination of required or voluntary within their MCAPS application that'll designate how you budget and under which components you're going to fill out. So let's walk through a couple of calculation scenarios. So right now we're looking at a school district that has chosen to voluntarily set aside CEIS funds. So here, Sunny Day School District wishes to voluntarily reserve funds for CEIS. The district will not reduce MOE, and we'll get to that a bit later in the presentation. The district received $1.4 million of their Section 611, so that's their Part B award, and $1 million for their Section 619 award, and that is their preschool award. So let's see how this calculation's done. So first, we add together the 1.4 and 1 million to get the total IDEA award. And then we multiply that by that maximum 15%. So again, there is that flexibility for LEAs that are voluntarily setting aside CEIS funds. The maximum amount that Sunny Day School District would be able to use is $360,000. But again, they have that flexibility that they can choose to use from 0% all the way up to that 15%. Again, no more than 15% for voluntary CEIS. And again, as a reminder, the LEA does maintain that flexibility to budget the amount from its 611, so IDA Part B, 619 or preschool grant, and or any combination of those that does not exceed that 15%.
So to make it clear about what you just said, Mari, for example, the LEA could choose to set aside $360,000, the whole amount from the 611 grants.
Exactly.
Only.
Exactly. Thank you, Anthony. Yeah. So it's up to the LEA to determine where they want to pull those funds from. And, you know, sometimes we see that the 611 preschool grant is so small that they really don't want to be using those funds on CEIS, and they want to reserve the entire portion from their 611 Part B award. And again, you know, they could choose just to set aside $150,000. It's up to the discretion of the district.
The two grant amounts are just used to help you make the calculation, but as soon as you have the calculation and the amount, budgeting is flexible.
Exactly. So this is different for mandatory CEIS. So now we're going to look at Snowy Day School District, who is required to set aside the maximum 15%. And a little bit of a cliffhanger, the process is exactly the same. However, the LEA is required to budget and expend that full 15%. So the district received $1 million from its Section 611 or Part B funds and $400,000 from its Section 619 or preschool fund. So we add those two amounts together. And again, as Anthony just said, this amount is used to make the total calculation. So the 15% is taken from that combined Section 611 and 619 award. Then we're going to multiply it by that maximum amount or required amount in this case, because they have been identified with significant disproportionality and they have to reserve the maximum of 15% of their total award, which gets us to our grand total of $210,000. So Snowy Day School District has to reserve and expend $210,000 for CCEIS activities. And again, that flexibility to budget and expend the amount from either your 611, 619, or combination is up to you. So in this case, you could decide that you don't need $400,000 for preschool. You may take $100,000 from there and then use the rest of it from your 611 or Part B award. The important part is that, again, they have to budget and expend that 15%. Okay. So now we're going to move to another poll. And I know that was a lot of information, so we can all take a breather with that poll.
Okay. So may an LEA reserve more than 15% of its IDEA Part B allocation, Section 611 and 619 for CEIS? Yes, no, or unsure? We should have had it, it depends. Yeah, so can you set aside more than 15% of the total allocation? And in the chat, we have Jay who says max of 15%.
Great. I'm glad that everyone was paying attention, or at least Jay.
Yeah, again, we'll give you a few more seconds to vote, and remember, this will be used to track your attendance for CPE credit hours. I think we can hand the poll.
Perfect.
And I'll go ahead and share the results so you can go over it.
And Anthony, I still cannot see the polls if you want to.
Oh,
I'm sorry, I don't know what's going on.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, so I do show that we have 76% of the audience who think it's a no, 20% yes, and 4% unsure. And the correct answer is no. 15% is the cap. You cannot go over that 15%. Under voluntary, you could do up to 15%, which means you could do less than 15%. When it's mandatory, it is exactly 15%. But under no circumstances, it could be more than 15% for either one of those.
Thank you, Anthony. And we have one more poll for you in this section. So an LEA that participates in voluntary CEIS must set aside exactly 15% of its total IDEA section 611 and 619 awards. True, false, or unsure?
We might have given you a hint in the previous question.
This is just to make sure you're paying attention.
Yeah, we'll give you guys a few more seconds before we close the poll. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and share the results. All right, 89% say false, 10% true, 1% unsure. An LEA that participates in voluntary CEIS must set aside exactly 15% is false. Because when you say must, it's an obligation. Or under voluntary CEIS, the word says it, it's voluntary, it's optional. So they may. Must is only applicable for the mandatory CEIS.
Perfect. Thank you, Anthony. And now I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing the result of the polls so that we can start talking about the next section. And I know we spent a lot of time talking about program and data, but I always believe that it's really hard to have a conversation around CEIS on the fiscal side without addressing data and program. I mean, there's just so much interconnection between the three aspects that it's really hard to just stay in the line of fiscal when you talk about CEIS. So I really appreciated all the great conversation we had. So now that we went over the calculation process of CEIS, then we wanted to talk to you about a really important provision under IDEA that could change the potential amounts that you can set aside for CEIS, for your voluntary CEIS. And if you go to the next slide, so here we will talk about the relationship that exists between CEIS and your LEA maintenance of effort. Under IDEA regulation, and this is the citation, with certain exceptions for any fiscal year in which an LEA Part B allocation exceeds the amount the LEA received for the previous year, the LEA may reduce its state and local support of special education by up to 50% of the amount of the increase in its Part B allocation. In other words, If between 2 fiscal years, your LEA received an allocation of your IDA Part B 3 to 21 grants, there is an allocation increase between year 1 and year 2. The total increase, when you divide that by 2, 50% of that increase could be an amount for which you will be allowed to reduce your maintenance of effort. And you could do that under certain conditions. And then I'll get to the correlation between that and CEIS, but I just wanted you to understand this concept so that it makes sense for you. So if you have an increase in IDA, you could use that 50% amount of increase as the amounts by which you can reduce your LEA MOE under which condition? If we go to the next slide. Can we go again? So the first condition is the LEA, if you choose to reduce your maintenance of efforts by the exact amount that is equal to your increase in allocation, 50% of your increase in allocation, then the amounts of funds that are being reduced must be shifted to be used for expenditures that are allowed under ESA. So it's not just a reduction with no consequences. You must be able to document that, I'm reducing maintenance of effort expenditures and reallocating expenditures to some activities that are allowable under ESA. That's the first condition. Second condition, you must have received a determination of meet requirements in the fiscal year for which you want to make an adjustment to your maintenance of effort. And you should not have had any action taken against you by the Mississippi Department of Education under section 616 of IDEA. And the responsibility of providing FIP should not have been taken away from you. So if you are no longer allowed to provide FIP, then you cannot take advantage of this provision. And then the last and the most important piece is not determined to have significant disproportionality for the fiscal year for which you are wanting to make that adjustment of your maintenance of effort. Which means when you have significant disproportionality, you have to do mandatory CEIS, and you cannot reduce your LEA MOE because of an allocation increase between 2 fiscal years. So these are the conditions. Now, if you go to the next slide, you must be careful. If you want to take advantage of the flexibility that IDEA offers to reduce your maintenance of efforts as a consequence of an increase of your allocation, and at the same time, you want to set aside funds for CEIS. That means you want to use the 2 provisions together. You must do it with caution because the 2 provisions interact. And then the interaction is simple. The amount of funds used for CEIS will affect the amounts your LEA will be allowed to reduce its MOE by. And then the next slide is just a citation in case you wonder where that interaction comes from. A citation of IDEA regulation says that the amount of funds expended by the LEA for early intervening services under 302.26, which is your voluntary CEIS, shall count towards the maximum amount of expenditure the LEA may reduce under paragraph A of so this paragraph is pretty much the one that is referring to your LEA MOE adjustments reduction as a consequence of an allocation increase. So the 2 provisions interact, and the next slide will just give you an example because I'm pretty sure what I was telling you here did not make sense, even to myself, as I was speaking, because it's just so many different words. But when I plug in numbers, they tend to make sense to me, and I hope it will for you. So this is a good example of an LEA that is wanting to use voluntary CEIS and also reduce LEA MOE because of an allocation increase. In year 1, the LEA 611 3 to 21 allocation was 1 million. And then in the current fiscal year, year 2, the allocation was 1.4 million. So there was an increase of 400,000 between 2 fiscal years. And in the current fiscal year, the LEA preschool or section 619 allocation was 100,000. So as a result, the maximum amount available for voluntary CEIS, going back to the calculation that Mary just showed you, you will take your 611 allocation plus your 619 allocation, multiply that by 15% to determine how much you could use for voluntary CEIS. In this case, for our example, that amount is 225,000. And now, since the LEA had an increase of its 611 or 3 to 21 allocation between the 2 fiscal years, there is a potential that the LEA could reduce its maintenance of effort. And then 50% of that allocation increase will be 400,000 divided by 2, which is 200,000. So with this example, you could do CEIS for 225,000 if you want to do CEIS, voluntary CEIS by itself. You could also do a reduction of your maintenance of efforts of 200,000 if you just do it by itself. However, if you decide to use the 2 provisions together, then under the current regulation, the maximum amount that you could use for both provisions is only 200,000. That means if you choose to reduce your maintenance of efforts because of an increase of your allocation, even if you reduce your maintenance of effort by maybe, let's say, 10,000, then the combination of the 10,000 plus what you can set aside for CEIS cannot exceed 200,000. And under this example, if, for example, you wanted to set aside more for voluntary CEIS, you now will be limited to just 200,000 because you decided to use the 2 provisions together in the same fiscal year. So it's just something to keep in mind, just in case you were thinking about taking advantage of the flexibility to reduce your maintenance of efforts and at the same time use your IDEA fund for voluntary CEIS. It's a little complicated, but I hope that the numbers made a little sense to you. And feel free if you did not understand it, we can try to clarify further. Okay, now that we've talked about calculating your CEIS amount, now we want to spend some time talking about how you can use those funds. You know, it's always good to know how much you can have, then how can you use it. I think we started a discussion on what can and cannot be used, but when you talk about allowability of use of funds, even for CES, if you go to the next slide, the period of performance obligation, if you're part of our training this morning, period of performance plays also a role. The CES funds are available during the same period that IDEA fund is available. So that means you could have your CES funds available for 27 months. If you did not use your full amount in year 1, you could carry over a portion of your CEIS funds in the subsequent year. And also, if an LEA voluntarily reserves CEIS funds, it may request the funds to be made available for other allowable use of Part B at any time during the 27 months. So let's say if you decided that, we want to set aside 15%, but in the middle of the school year, you realize that we might not be able to use the entire 15% for CEIS. You could do a budget revision and reallocate some of your CEIS funds for other IDEA Part B expenditures. Under voluntary CEIS, it's allowable. However, when we get to mandatory CCEIS, and then this is just referring back to whoever said, when we talk about mandatory CEIS, we need wine, is because, you know, it's just a lot of must. Under mandatory CEIS, you cannot do that. If you have to set aside 15%, you're stuck. Those funds must be used. And if you cannot use those funds, then you will not have the flexibility to reallocate those funds for other IDE purpose. That's a key difference. And then if you go to the next slide, you always have to remember, even for CEIS, that the cost to be allowable must be reasonable, necessary, and allocable under the IDA federal grants. I'm not going to spend too much time in it because we discussed it in the morning. All right, we go to the next slide. Okay, voluntary CEIS permitted activities. You could use your CEIS fund for professional development for teacher or other school staff, also for educational, behavioral evaluation services, and support, including scientifically based literacy instructions. So these are the general allowable use of funds for your voluntary CEIS. And for mandatory CEIS, those funds could also be used for PD, professional development, educational and behavioral evaluation services and support. But in addition to that, the funds must be, not may, but must be spent also to address factors contributing to significant disproportionality. And also, the funds must be used to address a policy, practice, or procedure identified by the LEA as contributing to significant disproportionality. So it's really important that any plan that you will develop under the mandatory CEIS somehow address the factors that are contributing to significant disproportionality, because the goal is to resolve the significant disproportionality. And at the same time, you have to be able to make some changes in your internal policy, practice, and procedures so that we could see some type of changes. So these are pretty much a broad overview and example of how these funds can be used. And now we want to go over a scenario that would give you an example of an LEA who wants to use voluntary CEIS fund for specific activities. And this example, if we go to the next slide, is about an LEA. During the planning of the fiscal year 2017 and 18 school year, the LEA staff reviewed data on math performance for kindergarten through 3rd grade children in the LEA, and they found three groups of children who did not meet at least one of the 4 formative math assessments benchmark that the LEA monitored in the school year 2016-17. So basically, the LEA identified 3 specific groups. The first group was a group of children who did not meet 1 or 2 benchmarks in the math assessments, and they did not qualify to receive any type of intervention. Also, they did not qualify to receive, they were not eligible for special education and related services. That's group 1. And we have a second group of students who did not meet 3 or 4 benchmarks of the math assessment. They were not eligible to receive special education and related services, but however, since they did not meet more than 2 benchmarks, they were eligible to receive some sort of intervention under RTI. And then we also have a third group of students who did not meet 4 benchmarks and also receive special education and related services. So under these circumstances, a good way to establish a CEIS plan with your voluntary CEIS fund would be to identify your target intervention. And if we go to the next slide, for this specific example, the target intervention is that the LEA wants to use CEIS funds to provide professional development. on scientifically based math intervention to all the teachers in kindergarten to third grade at the beginning of the school year. And then the target group, because they want to train the teacher so that the teacher could apply the knowledge to help a specific group of the students. And the target group here that will be identified is students who did not meet at least one or two of the benchmark in the math assessments, and they did not qualify to receive RTI or special education services. So in this situation, all the teachers who attended the training will be able to use knowledge that they received from the training and try to provide some type of intervention to those students who were not eligible to receive any other additional support. But because of the fact that they were already missing at least one or two of the benchmark, they could be potentially in need of receiving additional services. So you have identified your intervention and you have identified your group of students. And then the next item, if you go to the next slide, will be to track your students. So if you implement a plan like this one, then the students that you will need to track are the students that were pretty much identified in the target group. So they did not meet one or two of the math assessment benchmark, and they did not receive RTI and also did not receive special education fund. So you need to track the students and also report the students. So this is just a scenario of how you could try to design a plan that could be applicable to a professional development and try to tie the outcome to a specific group of students, and then tracking the students to be able to also track progress and outcome of your intervention for CEIS. Next slide, please. But planning and budgeting an allowable use of funds. So based on the planning that we discussed earlier, the LEA can budget and expend 15% of IDEA funds from Section 611 or Section 619 to provide professional development services, which will include paying for the actual cost of training, paying for any types of supplies or material for the training for these 60 teachers. And also funds, the LEA can use the funds to pay teacher to attend or pay for a substitute teacher during the training and also pay for a meeting space. So this is just a scenario that we wanted to share with you, just to give you an idea on how a good plan looks like and how you could apply, target your intervention, target your student group, and do the reporting. And with that being said, if we don't have any other question, I will let Marie take over from here so that we can do some polls.
Thanks, Anthony. So now is the funnest part of the presentation. Sorry, there was a lot of content in this session. We do want to move to test your knowledge, and I'm just going to do a quick time check for Anthony, Sarah, and Bobby, recognizing there's only 11 minutes left, so we'll probably only get through a few of these. So similar to our previous sessions, the way that this works is we're going to ask whether or not these costs are allowable, and you will be able to respond to the poll either yes, no, or it depends. So our first question is around supplemental intervention. So may CEIS or CCEIS funds be used to purchase supplemental interventions for a student determined to need this additional support to succeed in the general education program? And there's a lot of details and nuance with this question, so hopefully that helps.
Okay. And then this is the fun part where you get to share your opinion in the chat or unmute yourself. Well, we can unmute you so that you could come in the stage and become famous. why would you think this would be allowable, and why do you think it's not allowable, or why do you think it depends?
And our chat is looking a little empty here. Don't be shy.
This one isn't controversial enough. These guys are ready for the harder questions. This one's maybe too easy to stimulate much conversation.
Yeah, they don't feel challenged. That's why they're
No,
being
I don't
quiet.
think they, yeah.
Oh, finally, we see something. Can be used for identified and non-identified students. All students can have intervention, behavioral or academic, yes. Good ones. So I don't think the poll is progressing, so I'll go ahead and end and share the results. And then if we go back to the slide, generally I would say yes, it's an allowable expenditure. CEIS and CCEIS funds may be used to fund supplemental academic and behavioral intervention for students determined to need additional academic and behavioral supports to succeed in the general education setting. And Sarah, do you have anything else to say? We don't really need to say it
No, I
depends,
think,
because it's a
yeah.
yes.
Yeah, well, Leslie's point was really good. If it's voluntary and they have a disability, then the answer is no. So, yeah,
Oh,
for mandatory, yes, but Leslie, sorry, I don't think anyone can see that. Everyone can see that. Leslie Campanova put in the chat that it depends on whether the CEIS funds are voluntary or not, and whether the student is a special ed student, because that's true that one or the other can be, but if we're voluntary and there's students with disabilities, the answer would be no, but that's not the case. So yeah, let's go to the next one.
good one.
So may CEIS or CCEIS funds be used for the purchase of core curriculum? Yes, no, or it depends.
Okay.
And Anthony, I still can't see the polls. How are the responses looking?
Oh, we're still getting some votes here. Let's give it maybe 30 seconds.
Perfect. And we have some
Good job,
comments
Julie, in the chat. Yeah, not supplemental. This isn't
Mm-hmm.
additional supports to succeed, right? Everyone should have access to core curriculum.
Yeah, good one. Anything else? Anybody else? That's it. That was a solid no. That's, I mean, we have a few, it depends, and then I want to hear from them. Okay, so the poll is not progressing. I'll go ahead and end and share the results. 78% of the audience say no, 15 it depends, and 7 yes. And then going back to the slides, this is a no, like we saw in the chats. I mean, this is not supplemental. It's like, you know, it's core instruction. But I would have liked to hear from whoever said yes, because they might have some context that we don't have.
Yeah,
I would
and
like
we're
to
happy
hear
to
from
help work through that context. Don't be shy. But yeah, what I'm seeing in the chat is a lot of the same thing. The core curriculum hasn't been working. I guess if for some reason the students didn't receive it last year, but then it wouldn't have been core. So
yeah, and I think we only have 5 minutes left. Do you want to just close it out and do some housekeeping?
Yes, I think so. So again, there's a ton of examples to bring this full circle for you. So we encourage you to look at the slides and the handouts after. Similar to the allowable use of funds, there will be a supplemental handout for CEIS that will be coming to you. This is another great tool if you haven't heard of it, the CEIS Fiscal and Student Data Tracker, and that is through IDC as well. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Lastly, I feel like we always skip this, but we always include a list of additional resources at the end of every presentation. So do feel free to go through these. There's a ton of really great information. Sarah talked about, I think, the comparison document. There's also a link to OSEP's memo on CEIS. And our last poll of the day, and sorry, Anthony,
Yeah.
I still can't do it, but we'd love to hear, now that you've heard our presentation, how you rate your knowledge of voluntary CEIS as well as comprehensive CEIS fiscal requirements under IDEA.
Yep. We want to know if we confused you more, or if we helped you make progress. We'll give it maybe 30 seconds before we close. MOE part was super confusing, but it's always is to me. Yeah. And I'm not surprised, Julie.
That section is really confusing in general. It'll take you a couple times looking over the slides, but eventually it will make sense. Unfortunately, that's a complicated one.
Sarah, you're muted.
I think it's hard from the beginning because we're not used to IDEA funds increasing that much. So it's hard to envision what that looks like. So
and also
next year we'll get that a little more.
And also hard for the Mississippi because MOE is done at the state level. So district are not really familiar with maintenance of effort. So I'm not surprised because the state does the work for you.
Yeah, big shout out to our friends over at the Office of Grants Management, Michael and Mary, if you are still here. You are much appreciated by all of the districts here. Definitely. And really quick, as people begin to hop off, just wanted to also flag that we do have a brief evaluation survey. So if you could take a few seconds to respond to that, we would really appreciate it. Again, if you are interested in receiving those CPE hours, then fill out the contact information at the bottom.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for all the positive responses in the chat.
And also, can you unmute Bree or Susan so they can do just some last minute things with the overall evaluation for the 3 days altogether?
Of course. And Anthony, did you end up sharing out what the results were? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm sharing it right now, and we have 7% strong, 57%, 7% very strong, 57% strong, and 36% fair. I can't remember where we started, but did we make any movements?
Yes, Sarah? We did. From the beginning of the session at 1:30, we did make some improvement. So yes.
Okay.
We did. We started with a handful in week, or a handful in week, and almost everyone in fair. The majority were in fair, so we've shifted up to strong. So that's great, and we appreciate you all attending. Your engagement has made this really fun for us too. So thank you for asking questions and being open with your questions and willing to share. So thank you.
Okay, thank you so
Bree
much.
or Susan, are either one of you on the call?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay.
Thank you so much. And thank you participants for being engaged. I know this is a lot of valuable information. So with this, I do plan on, I know you've got emails every day about the handouts, but I will send all of the handouts from this SPED training to you just so you can have it all in one place. I know there's kind of a lot going on. About 30 minutes ago, I sent an email to everyone who attended Monday's session. The reason I only sent it to those who attended Monday's session are those because the people who attended Monday are kind of the only people who are going to be allowed to get CEU or semi-credit if they attended Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. If you only attended one session or one day's worth of sessions, the only credit you will be applicable for is contact hours. And those hours will automatically be applied to your account as soon as I can verify your attendance. We are working with MDE to get those spreadsheets of the participants, and I'm hoping by the end of the week, everyone's account will have the contact hours. You have my email address. Again, my name is Brianna Stewart. I've been the one sending the emails about how to get the pre-emails with all of the links. I apologize. If you have a question or your certificate's not there, I would say no later than Monday. If your certificate's not there, send me an email. Let me kind of check the status of it just to make sure everything matches up between everyone else. Are there any questions about that process? I know it's kind of a lot.
Thank you, Bree. Thank you, Susan, and for all your help in facilitating and all that y'all do at the North Mississippi Education Consortium for us, and the help that you provide to us. I know Maury has put the survey for this afternoon session in the chat box a few times. Make sure that you please click on that and provide us feedback. We need to know the good, the bad, and the ugly. I've had several directors and even a few of the business managers that happen to know my cell phone number have texted me yesterday and today on how well these fiscal sessions have been and how beneficial. Several of you have also put that in the chat. Please complete that survey that Maury has put to let us know. I feel like these have been very beneficial, and I would like to continue to do things like this and offer specific office hours time for fiscal so you can chat and we can answer questions. And so we need to know those kind of things if these are beneficial. This concludes our session on CEIS fiscal requirements that we've scheduled for this week. Thank you all for joining and staying with us these past 3 days. We appreciate each of you. Let us know how we can assist you. We're all in this together. We'll be glad to set up any type of TA calls or visits if we need to. Just let us know how we can assist you. Maury, Sarah, Anthony, do y'all have any final comments? I know we're a couple of minutes over, but we still have some hanging in here with us.
No, thank you very much. We really enjoyed spending these 2 days with the state of Mississippi. We hope we'll have more opportunities like that again in the future.
Okay, thank you. Maury, if you want to look in the chat, you should have access to these emails. There's a few that say when they click on the survey, it's not open. It opened fine for me, but now again, it may be something to do with their firewall or something. But it is a SurveyMonkey link, just like the 2 yesterday and the one this morning was. It's just different questions based on this afternoon session.
It could also be a pop-up blocker.
Yes.
If you have it in your computer.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Julie. Look forward to seeing you all soon, hopefully one day soon, face-to-face. But just let any of us know here in the Office of Special Education if there's anything that we can do for you or if you need our assistance for anything. Once we have the recordings completely ready, we will send the recording of the trainings out, as well as the PowerPoint presentation and PDF again, and the 2 supplemental handouts that Maury mentioned, the one on allowable uses of funds and the one on the quick reference guide for CEIS. We will have those and send those to you as soon as we have those ready. Thank you all. Have a good afternoon.
Bye.
Great. Thank you. Take care.